All right, so I mentioned how many people had heard of the instinct, like the behavior instinct. How many have heard this? Shaping is an art more than a science. How many people have heard that phrase? Lindsay says yes. Yep. And in some ways, it's got some truth to it, right? Because even though I'm going to show you the mathematics behind shaping, we're not going to be pulling out a spreadsheet every time we go to reinforce something. Instead, what we're going to do is understand the equation that we can use and the variables to manipulate to make shaping, to change the way somebody responds to your shaping. Because at its core, all shaping is looking at a behavior and deciding based on your past behaviors, should we reinforce this or not? Right. So I'm working with a kid. We're trying to get them to increase the amount of time sitting at a table for table time or something. And I see that our goal is we're trying to get to 5 minutes. Their last three were 10 seconds, 12 seconds, and 15 seconds. And then they sit for 14 seconds before getting up. So it's not like the highest one in their last three, but it's not bad. It's up there with the top. Would you reinforce that? Should you? Well, probably, right? If they're generally speaking increasing in the amount of time they're able to tolerate, then we would think, yeah, we should keep shaping that and reinforcing it and taking those steps. That kind of gut instinct is what the percentile schedule starts to objectify. And it does this with an interesting little equation that says K equals M plus 1 minus W. K is the response value that the next behavior must exceed, meaning if I'm shaping something and I'm trying to get to 5 minutes and the kid gave me a 10 second, a 13 second, and a 15 second, my K would say it has to be 14 seconds or higher. Right? So K gives me the criteria that the learner has to exceed in order to get reinforcement. M is the number of recent observations, basically how far back do I look. In severe behavior, for example, sometimes you're looking for 3 sessions or 5 sessions to see what the behavior was, to see if we're reinforcing the next behavior. And to be clear, this could be skill acquisition of learning that alternative skill. That's typically how I use a percentile schedule. It could also be behavior reduction. For example, minutes from XYZ behavior, right, in our response time and increasing that in our response time as the intervention continues. And finally, W, what I would call the most important variable here, is the density of reinforcement. The density of reinforcement can range from, think of it as the probability that a learner gets reinforced. So in general, regardless of what shaping step you're doing, do you want a lot of reinforcement appearing, such as errorless learning, or do you want a low probability of reinforcement appearing, closer to like extinction with extinction-induced variability? So a W of 0.1 means that there's a 10% chance that a response is going to be reinforced. A W of 0.9 means there's a 90% chance something's going to be reinforced. We'll talk a little bit we'll talk a little bit in later slides about kind of how that comes into play and how changing those variables matter. But essentially, these 3 variables make up what I would call the art of shaping, right? Because at its core, when you make a decision on shaping, right, we're saying, does this exceed the thing that I wanted in the first place? Does it exceed that K based on the amount of observations I had in the past? And does it meet that probability of reinforcement? Are we reinforcing too much or too little? And if it meets all of those criteria, then we reinforce. All right, we're going to skip through those as we're nearing the end of time, and I want to show a couple examples. So once again, let's look at our spreadsheet. And to be clear, while this will be something you'll have access to, I encourage you not to simply use this as your in a day-to-day session. I want you to understand why things change, not specifically step 1 through 5, this entire thing. So let's look for a second at these variables again. So the percentile schedule is the equation to objectify the shaping process. K is the response value the next behavior must exceed. That is this variable right here. So this is the equation that's going to spit out for us. Now let's put in the variables. Let's say for M, we want to look at the last 5 occurrences of behavior. So we're going to take a baseline of 5, and we're going to use that amount to determine what the next response should exceed. The density of reinforcement, the W, is generally speaking, do we want a lot of reinforcement or do we want a little reinforcement? Let's say for this example, we want 70%. So we do a 0.7. So that means that if we round up, the criteria the response has to exceed is 2. And we'll talk about that, how we get there in a second. All right, so here's our data. We need 5 trials for baseline. And so we're going to say that this person completed step 1, step 1, step 1, step 2, and step 1. So for baseline, they completed step 1, which was hold toy plus no SIB, and they got 1 engage for 5 seconds plus no SIB. Then, and once again, this is not what you should do on a session-by-session basis, but just to show you the system, you're going to copy that step completed, you're going to put it in here, and you're going to order it from smallest to largest. So we're going to sort smallest to largest. And that 1.8 right there means in order for a response to be reinforced, it has to meet or exceed step 2. Basically, it has to be higher than the, sorry, let me highlight this. It has to at least be higher than step 1 in order to be reinforced. So for this learner, if their next response was a 2, would that be reinforced? Well, yes, because they had to get at least more than that 1. And so they would get reinforced. And then their next goal would be these same 5, ordered from smallest to largest. Sort. And it would still be a 1. And so the goal that they would have to hit is a 2. And as we progress, and I'll just skip through, assuming that shaping is going well, what we'll see is that the percentile schedule automatically changes what the goal is going to be. So now the goal has to be a 3 or above. So now instead of a 2, now the goal is a 3. And so if a person engages in a 2, which is step 2, engage the toy for 5 seconds and have no SIB, well, suddenly that isn't a reinforced behavior, right? So the percentile schedule tells you when to reinforce and it tells you when not to reinforce. Now, let's take a step back from the spreadsheet. Once again, I'm starting to think that this needs to be another hour to go into more examples, but I want to kind of wrap it up and bring it broad strokes. We should not be pulling out a spreadsheet and doing a calculation between every response. Instead, we should understand the way the variables change the behavior and have the pros and cons calculated in. So the question that you have to make as a clinician really comes down to, should I increase the density of reinforcement or should I increase the amount of time it takes, or the observation space, which changes the reinforcer, right? Should I increase the W or increase the M? Increasing the W has the biggest effect, right? So increasing the reinforcement density says larger W, more reinforcement, meaning the learner is less likely to contact extinction and more likely to experience what's akin to errorless learning. And what do we know about the pros and cons of this? Well, if we're closer to errorless learning, then we're going to have a slower learning process. Our graph is going to look more like this, right? Slow and steady increases. Because errorless learning, while it results in very little errors, it also is slower than error correction, right? Which is kind of the other side of the equation with a low reinforcement density. What this is really good for is when you're trying to be cautious on a response class. Let's say you're dealing with head banging and your alternative behavior is asking for attention or something, or tolerating XYZ for 5 minutes. Well, if the risk of this intervention not working and the risk of an extinction burst is head banging on concrete, well, we need to be very cautious with that response class. So you would want to do a high reinforcer density, which means you would create your intervention with very small shaping steps. Once again, this is how you objectify the term micro shaping in SBT. Right? Very tiny, small shaping steps, low or high reinforcement density, which means slow and steady progress. What about for quick acquisition? Well, then we can decrease the reinforcement density, right? So a smaller W means less reinforcement, which means the learner is going to experience extinction more often, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because when you experience extinction, you also have extinction-induced variability, which means that you're more likely to make big jumps in your learning. So your skill acquisition progress is going to look closer to this. Hopefully still going in the right direction, but with much more variability as you go. The big con is that extinction is met more often, which, like I said, if extinction risks significant danger, then this would not be the route to go. But what if extinction didn't meet significant danger? What if this was a social skill? What if this was a learner whose most severe behavior was something that didn't risk their health? Well, in that case, maybe it's worthwhile to have a larger probability of extinction, but they can master this faster. And once again, in the shaping process, we do this naturally, right? So what you've probably experienced when you're shaping is something that looks like this. As you kind of increase in complexity, as you go from 1 second to 5 second to 30 second to 1 minute, you're probably taking small steps at the beginning. But as the learner gets better and better at the skill, you start taking bigger steps, right? And so by the end, you're going from 2 minutes to 3 minutes. And at the beginning, you're going from 5 seconds to 10 seconds. See you later, Michaela. So we naturally do this. The difference here is that instead of just doing it based on instinct, you can do it objectively by reinforcing that W value, right? And what that means is that we can better train our staff to follow through with the intervention over and over again, and not have